I went to the corner cafe mostly out of habit. Not the kind of habit that saves your day, just the kind you notice in the quietest moments, like waiting for the barista to pour a latte while you flick through the same magazine cover you've seen 3 times already. The bell above the door jingled when I pushed it open, a sound that somehow always made me aware of how empty the place felt before anyone else arrived. She was there, naturally, sitting at the window table I'd sometimes choose when no one else was around. Mid-40s, maybe a little older than that, gray at the temples, a line in her smile that didn't quite hide the years. She had a notebook open, pen poised over a blank page. I watched her thumb a loose strand of hair back behind her ear. It was the sort of tiny movement that makes you notice everything at once. The way her hand lingered, the crease in her wrist, how the sunlight hit her shoulder. "Hey," I said, voice softer than I meant. She looked up, eyebrows rising, that half smile I remembered. The one that felt like a question. "Hey," she replied. Her voice was calm, even, but there was something in the way she held the cup between both hands that made it she'd noticed I was there before I even spoke. I ordered a coffee and, while she returned to her notebook, I lingered near the counter, catching glimpses of her out of the corner of my eye. She was humming a tune I couldn't place, tapping the pen against the paper once, twice, and then stopping abruptly, as if realizing she shouldn't have been making noise. I thought about the texts I'd drafted last night, never sent, my fingers hovering over the send button before deciding they weren't brave enough. She looked up again, and this time, our eyes met for a moment that stretched too long. My hands, suddenly idle, fiddled with the napkin folded neatly under my cup. A small smile tugged at her lips. "You always take it black, right?" she asked as if she remembered, even though I'd never mentioned it aloud. "Yeah," I said, surprised. "How do you remember that?" "Observant," she said, eyes flicking to mine and back to her notebook. "Or maybe just patient." She shrugged, a small motion, but enough to make me notice the way her sleeve slid back a little on her arm. I wanted to tell her why I was here, why I'd walked past the park, the laundry, the streets I knew too well just to find this quiet corner. But the words stuck somewhere behind my ribs. I let them, because maybe the silence said more than any apology ever could. She scribbled something, then looked up. "You've been quiet lately," she said. No judgment, just observation. I shrugged, smiling faintly, though it didn't reach my eyes. "You're right," I said. And then, after a pause that felt both too long and not long enough, I asked, "Can I sit?" She nodded. Her hand moved just slightly closer to mine across the table, not touching, just hovering, like a question in itself. The way she leaned forward, unconsciously closing a space I had planned to cross slowly, made my chest tighten. I tried to make sense of it, of the way she looked at me, the way the light caught her hair, the subtle warmth in her voice. I thought about all the unsent apologies, the half-written messages, the quiet nights when I felt like the only one who noticed the empty spaces around me. And then she said it, casually, almost as if she had rehearsed it for months. "Walk me to the bookstore after this." I blinked. For a moment, I didn't speak, didn't move. Just watched her, this woman who had somehow closed the distance before I even realized I wanted to. Something in me tightened and loosened at the same time. Something unspoken had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I was ready. Yet I nodded. We walked to the bookstore in silence, the kind that's heavy but not unpleasant. The streets smelled faintly of rain and baked bread from a nearby shop. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, noting how her scarf fell just so over her shoulder, how her steps were steady but deliberate. Inside, the bookstore smelled of old paper and varnish. She led me past stacks of novels, reaching for a thin hardcover with a neat flick of her wrist. "I used to come here with my son," she said quietly, almost as if sharing a secret she hadn't spoken in years. "He loved the fantasy section. We'd spend hours getting lost." I nodded, unsure what to say. I could feel the gaps in that confession. Not just her son, not just the years, but the careful distance she always maintained. It made me aware of my own youth, my own restlessness. Yet something in her voice made the space between us feel almost alive, like the air itself had noticed. I imagined what it would be like if there weren't these unspoken rules. If her past didn't weigh so heavily on her, if my own life wasn't a series of finished degrees and empty apartment walls. My fingers brushed a stack of poetry books, and I caught myself thinking how easy it would be to imagine another life, where she leaned closer without hesitation. She noticed the tension in my hands and smiled faintly. I make this look easy, don't I? I shook my head, laughing softly, more out of nerves than amusement. No, you just look like you know exactly where you're going. We settled at a small table near the back, teacups steaming between us. I poured a bit of honey into hers, and she let me, barely brushing my fingers as I handed it over. That brief contact made my chest tighten in a way that made me embarrassed to admit I noticed it at all. So, you're not seeing anyone, she said, almost offhandedly, but her gaze lingered long enough for me to feel it pressing against my own truth. I didn't answer immediately. The words were stuck somewhere between polite honesty and a confession I wasn't ready to voice. I'm figuring things out, I said finally. Same, she replied, and for a moment, her eyes softened like she might be letting me in further than she usually did. There was a quiet pause, just the clock ticking somewhere above the shelves, and I noticed her hand inching closer to mine on the table. Not touching, just a suggestion of proximity, a question that didn't need words. I cleared my throat, suddenly aware of the heat in my palms. I don't know why that moment stayed with me, I admitted, voice low. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then, as if to break the tension, she nudged my shoulder gently with hers. It was a light, casual touch, but in that weightless second, it said more than any apology, any confession, or any hesitation could. I laughed softly, heart thrumming in a way that made me feel both guilty and alive. She smiled, eyes flicking toward the window where the first drizzle had begun to fall. And just like that, the ordinary afternoon felt a little less ordinary, and I couldn't stop thinking about how much I wanted it to last. The drizzle had stopped by the time we left the bookstore, leaving the pavement slick and reflective under the streetlights. I kept my hands in my pockets, though I wanted to brush hers, to feel the warmth I'd been noticing all afternoon. She walked a step ahead, scanning the street as if deciding the safest road home. I should probably check on my son, she said, but there was a pause, like she'd added that line for me more than for herself. I nodded, unsure how to respond, caught in the weight of that half-step toward goodbye. We lingered on the corner, neither wanting to move first. I noticed the way her scarf slipped again, exposing the curve of her neck. I swallowed, knowing I shouldn't stare, but unable to help it. She flicked her eyes toward me, caught my hesitation, then looked away, tugging her coat tighter around her shoulders. I tried to speak, words breaking off in my throat. Don't, she said softly, before shaking her head, as if trying to erase the thought she thought I'd have. The silence between us was dense, layered with things neither of us could, or would, say. I watched her fingers twist the edge of her sleeve, small, deliberate, like she was grounding herself. My own hands fidgeted with the zipper of my jacket. I felt both the pull toward her and the sudden, inexplicable distance she insisted on keeping. As we started walking again, a friend of hers appeared from the corner, waving and calling her name. She stiffened, smiled quickly, and nodded. I felt the shift immediately. The ease of the afternoon replaced by something watchful, polite. I stepped back slightly, giving space, though it made my chest ache more than the closeness had. "You'll have to excuse me," she said to me, though her eyes lingered on mine a little longer than necessary. She waved at her friend, the gesture small but deliberate, like she was choosing how much of herself she could share. I followed a few steps behind, aware of how much I wanted to close the distance again, but unsure if it was allowed, or if she even wanted it. Every instinct I had told me to reach for her hand, brush a strand of hair behind her ear, lean closer. But she stayed just beyond the edge, teasing me with proximity without surrender. We turned a corner, and the streetlight caught her face. I wanted to say something, anything, but all that came out was a quiet, half-laugh. She tilted her head and for a second, we were so close I could feel the faint warmth of her breath. I thought about leaning in, closing the gap entirely, but stopped. Her eyes flicked downward for a heartbeat, and then back to mine. I could see the hesitation there, a mirrored reflection of my own. A step too close, a pause too long. The world had narrowed to that half-second, and I realized we were standing on a line neither of us was ready to cross. I exhaled, small and tearful. She did too, almost simultaneously. "Walk me to the corner," I asked, voice lower than I meant. She nodded, a slow, measured nod, letting me stay near enough to feel the tension, the pull, but not enough to bridge it fully. And as we moved again through the slick streets, I thought about how fragile the afternoon had become, how easily a single step could undo what we were both pretending not to feel. We ended up on the park bench near the fountain, the water dripping in uneven rhythms that matched my heartbeat. She sat with her bag resting on her lap, hands folded loosely over it. I stayed a careful distance away, though the urge to lean closer kept pressing at my ribs. I started, then stopped. My throat felt tight, like every word I wanted to say had been packed into a suitcase I couldn't open. She watched me, eyes soft, patient, but not entirely still. There was something in the way she shifted, brushing a wet strand of hair from her forehead, that made my stomach twist. "You're quiet today," she said. It wasn't a question, but it landed between us heavier than a sentence could. "I don't know why," I admitted, my voice low, almost a whisper. I wanted to tell her everything. How the memory of her smile made the walls in my apartment feel suffocating, how every unsent text felt like a missed chance. But I didn't. The words hovered in the air, unspoken, trembling. She leaned back, letting her gaze drift to the fountain. "I keep thinking, maybe I shouldn't," she said slowly, almost like trying it out in the space between us. Her fingers twitched against the strap of her bag, and I realized she meant what I'd been afraid to ask: what we were doing, what we were becoming. I felt a flash of something raw, fear, maybe guilt, maybe longing, and I shifted on the bench closer just a few inches. I don't know if I can wait anymore," I said, voice breaking slightly. The words were sharper than I expected, exposing more than I intended. She looked at me then, full on, the fountain's reflection dancing in her eyes. A pause stretched longer than it should have, filled with all the things we hadn't said, couldn't say. I could see the hesitation in her jaw, the way her hand hovered over the edge of the bag. "I sure if it should reach for mine. I shouldn't feel this way," she whispered finally, though the words didn't carry judgment. They were an admission, raw and fragile. And yet, I didn't move, afraid that any shift would close the careful space she was keeping. My own hands curled into fists in my lap, not from anger but from wanting to do something, anything, to anchor this fleeting moment. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves, coffee from earlier, and something indefinable, us maybe. I imagined pressing closer, the sound of her breath, the warmth just beyond reach. I imagined letting it all fall, letting the pause between us finally break. But she hadn't moved, not yet. "Do you?" I started, letting the words trail. The question didn't need an ending, it was a bridge I couldn't decide whether to cross. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that carried more weight than any sentence could. And for the first time, I realized just how precarious we were, perched on a quiet edge neither of us dared to step off entirely. The fountain splashed, a single droplet hitting the bench between us. It felt like a warning. Or maybe an invitation, I didn't know which. The next week I didn't hear from her. Not a text, not a call. Not even a note slipped between the pages of the bookstore. I found myself checking the cafe at odd hours, lingering by the counter like a fool, scanning for her familiar figure. When I finally saw her again, she was with someone. Her son, I realized, taller than I'd imagined, laughing too loudly at something she said. She looked up, caught my eye for a fraction of a second, and the smile that usually reached her eyes felt smaller, measured. We exchanged nothing beyond a nod. I wanted to cross the distance, ask her to explain, to tell her I didn't care about the sun standing there, or the judgment in the air. But I stayed back, hands shoved into my jacket pockets, noticing the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the faint crease in her forehead, the way she didn't reach for me. I imagined every possibility. Maybe she thought I was too young. Maybe she was afraid of what others might say. Maybe she was just busy. Each scenario twisted my chest a little tighter. Days passed. I drafted messages on my phone, each one unsent. "I miss you. Can we talk? I'm here if you want." I stared at the words, thumb hovering over send, then deleted them all. I couldn't force her to close the gap, and I couldn't risk the gap widening. When she finally came to the cafe alone, the energy was different. She ordered her coffee without looking at me, busy with her notebook, pen moving faster than it had before. I sat at the usual corner table, pretending to read, noticing the way her eyes darted occasionally toward the window, toward me, but never fully meeting my gaze. I wanted to ask about the week, about the absence, about the sun, about the way she seemed distant. But each question felt like a step she might not want me to take. So I sat silent, watching, feeling the invisible wall she'd built thicker than before. She stirred her coffee slowly, tapping the spoon against the edge of the cup, a small, deliberate rhythm. I traced the pattern with my eyes, noticing the way her fingers flexed just enough to reveal the faintest tremor, the only hint that she might be feeling something, anything, beyond the ordinary. When she finally left, she didn't say goodbye. I didn't move. The empty chair across from me felt heavier than the bag of groceries she'd carried past me. I wanted to chase her, to tell her she didn't have to be careful with me, that the space between us didn't have to be measured in footsteps and glances. But I didn't. Instead, I watched the door close behind her, letting the echo linger. My phone lay on the table, messages drafted, unsent, words that would wait. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. And somewhere in the quiet, I realized I had no idea when, or if, the sentence would ever be finished. I found her at the cafe again, closing up for the evening. The lights were low, the smell of coffee and warm pastry still lingering. She was stacking chairs, humming softly, the movements careful and deliberate. I hesitated by the door, feeling the familiar tug in my chest, the same one that had kept me circling her for weeks. "Hey," I said finally. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. She looked up, eyes widening just slightly, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Hey," she said back, setting the last chair down. Her hands rested on the edge of the counter, fingers lacing together. I could see the faint tremor in her knuckles, the same one I'd noticed before, only now it felt like a signal she was waiting too. I stepped closer, uncertain, letting my gaze follow her movements. I've been thinking." She nodded slowly, not interrupting, letting me feel exposed. I felt exposed, like a part of me I usually kept tucked away had been pulled forward. "About us. About this," a voice trailing off. Her eyes softened, careful, weighing each word I might say next. She tilted her head, the movement small, deliberate. "Go on," she whispered. I swallowed. The words were heavy with weeks of absence, hesitation, and longing. "I don't want to lose this, you. Even if it's complicated, or wrong in some ways, I want to be here. With you. And I can't keep pretending I'm okay stepping back every time things get real." Her lips parted slightly, not in surprise, not in words, but the pause felt like an answer. I could see the conflict in her eyes, years, choices, responsibilities, caution, all dancing behind that quiet mask she wore so well. "I don't know if I can promise anything," she said finally. Her voice was soft, but there was a weight in it that made my chest tighten. "But I don't want you to leave." We stood there in the half-light of the cafe, both aware of the fragile line between risk and retreat. I wanted to reach out, to close the space, to let my hand brush hers, but I paused, letting her decide. She stepped closer on her own, just a small shift, just enough to let our shoulders brush, enough for the warmth to register in my chest. I noticed her breathing, quiet and steady, a rhythm I felt I could learn by heart. "Okay," she said finally, a single word, soft, careful like a promise without overstatement. I nodded. The tension in my shoulders eased slightly, not gone, but contained. There was no grand confession, no declaration, just the acknowledgement that we had crossed a line neither of us could ignore anymore. We didn't kiss. We didn't hug. But I felt something heavier than either. A quiet permission to be present, to continue walking this precarious path together. I lingered, letting my eyes track her hands as they returned to work, and I realized that sometimes, the simplest gestures, the brush of a shoulder, a soft okay, could carry more weight than any elaborate words. And in that moment I felt the pool of possibility, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably ours. It had been months since that evening in the cafe, but some things stayed the same. I still came at the same hour, around 8:47 a.m., ordering my black coffee without thinking. She still preferred her tea, the one she stirred slowly, letting the spoon tap the cup like a quiet metronome. But now, she'd glance up at me sometimes, letting our eyes meet for a fraction longer, a silent acknowledgement that we were still here, still trying. We had settled into a rhythm neither of us could have predicted. She would talk about her son occasionally, and I would listen, noticing the way her voice softened when she spoke about him, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, just like she always had. I no longer felt like I had to measure every movement, every word, every thought. The park bench we had once hesitated on was still there, near the fountain, though the water was colder now. One Saturday, we found ourselves sitting there again, sharing a quiet afternoon. She didn't push me away, I didn't rush in. We just existed in the same space, the world shrinking to the rhythm of the fountain, the weight of shared silence, and the occasional scrape of a falling leaf. I noticed the small things. The flick of her eyes toward my hands, the way she smiled at a joke she'd almost forgotten she was telling me, the subtle warmth in her shoulder, when we leaned close to reach for the same book in the cafe. There was no grand gesture, no declaration, just the intimacy of ordinary moments stacked together like fragile bricks, holding something steady between us. Some mornings, I still draft messages I don't need to send. She still teases me about it sometimes, leaning across the counter in the cafe, eyes glinting, voice soft. You don't have to announce everything. And I smile, because I've learned that sometimes the quietest love is the loudest in the spaces it fills. We've stumbled, of course. A missed text, a forgotten meeting, a word that came out wrong. But we've learned the rhythm of repair, the small art of patience. And when the world feels too loud or heavy, we retreat to the corner where we started. Tea, coffee, soft smiles, and the occasional shared laugh that neither of us wants to end. One morning, I noticed her looking at the fountain, hands wrapped around her cup. I leaned closer, letting my shoulder brush hers lightly. She looked at me, a slow smile spreading across her face. You remembered, she whispered, not about a moment, not about a time, but about how we had begun, and how far we'd come. And in that glance I realized we didn't need words. We didn't need grand declarations. We had something quietly earned, a fragile permanence built out of the ordinary, the overlooked, and the quietly intimate. I took a slow sip of my coffee, warm in my hands, and thought, this is enough. This is us.